Okay, let's move on. What about wars? A Russian invasion of Ukraine could trigger the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II, says Sir Tony Radakin, head of UK Armed Forces. Ukrainian military intelligence believes Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine at the beginning of 2022, in January or February, as its massed forces are massing on Ukraine's eastern border. Around 175,000 Russian troops backed by hundreds of heavy artillery weapons, tanks already in place. Ukraine's intelligence chief Kirilo Budanov said the US should deter a Russian invasion by increasing its military support for Kiev. Russia's denied it has any intention to invade Ukraine, but Russia's already denied such things and done them in the past. What's all that about? If you know your geography, you know that Russia is in east of Europe. In 1941, the Nazis, having failed to invade Britain after the Battle of Britain, decided to invade Russia. And they did so. Invaded right through Russia with Operation Barbarossa. In the process, around 20 million Russians died. What they called the Great Patriotic War. Went through Ukraine, up into Russia, nearly got to Moscow, and eventually Hitler was turned back by the Russian winter and by the fact that he'd overextended his troops and wasn't able to supply them, and it was the beginning of the defeat of Nazi Germany. But it was a traumatic experience for Russia. And after the war, when Russia won the war and went into Berlin, they then decided they would set up a block of states on its western border, which would be its defense against anything like that ever happening again. So it set up communist states in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia. All those countries became communist and were like Russia's defense against anything coming from the West. Then in 1989, all those countries turned from being communist and kicked out communism. And Russia found itself with these states on its border, now turning to the European Union and NATO. 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, and the countries of the Baltics and all those countries became free from Russia. And the Baltic states particularly joined the European Union and NATO, and Russia saw now that it had NATO right on its border. And Ukraine is probably the heartland of pro-Russian, in the past, pro-Russian sympathy. It's called Little Russia within Russia. One thing that Russia said would never happen is Ukraine should move to the West European bloc, which is precisely what the Ukrainians want to do right now. But they've been working on that for the last 5 years since they had a bit of a revolution and kicked out the pro-Russian group and want to join the European Union and join NATO. Russia says, no way. Biden has said, when NATO said, well, if they want to join, they can join. In fact, this week, Biden and Putin had a phone call to discuss the matter. President Biden urged Russia to de-escalate tensions in Ukraine. He said that the United States and its allies, partners would respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine. Russia denied it had an intention to invade Ukraine, which I don't believe. According to Russian agency TASS, Putin's proposals called for the United States to take measures to prevent further eastward expansion of the NATO and to deny accession to the alliance to the former USSR republics. How's it going to go? Well, probably the next couple of weeks are going to tell you, so this is something which is not in the distant future, it's happening right now. ABC News had a report that the United States Embassy in Kiev is working on emergency preparations in the event it must evacuate non-emergency personnel or diplomats' families due to a Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's the latest news. So if they're talking about now getting their embassy out of Kiev, that means they're taking it seriously, that it could happen. If it does happen, then this could be a major event. Seems pretty unthinkable after the end of the Cold War that you could have a war with Russia. Of course, nobody wants to have a war with Russia because Russia is highly nuclear armed. It's got hypersonic missiles which travel so fast and so low they can't be picked up by any anti-missile defense system. And obviously, if there was a nuclear war involving Russia and the United States, there wouldn't be much left of the planet. Now, I don't think it's going to happen because, as far as my understanding of Bible prophecy, there's not going to be anything like this happening before the second coming of Jesus. So not after the second coming of Jesus, but I think that there will be things which will stop it from happening. But there's a very dangerous situation at the present time. Probably you may not know too much about it. And it's another warning that the world is in a very unstable situation. The least worst situation would be that there is some kind of limited Russian intrusion into Ukraine, then they put sanctions upon Russia, and one of the results of that would be that Russian gas stops coming into Western Europe. Russian gas stops coming into Western Europe, then basically the lights will start going out, particularly in Germany and throughout much of the European Union, because one of the major power supplies in Western Europe is Russian gas. Especially as the Germans in particular go more down the green route and start shutting down their coal power stations and their nuclear power stations. So they're now even more dependent upon Russia. So there's a potential there for a real crisis taking place. Pray that it won't be, but it's there. Jesus said there may be wars or rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. This is another situation facing the world. You've got another one in the Far East, China and Taiwan. Anyone know anything about that one? Taiwan, island off China, which is independent from Beijing. It's not part of the communist Chinese. It was, after the war, it remained nationalist China, separate from communist China. Has a treaty with America, and actually its leader has actually confirmed that there are now American troops on Taiwanese soil. The Communist Party leader of China, Xi Jinping, said, quote, about Taiwan, resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification is a historic mission, unshakable commitment of the Communist Party of China. Earlier this month, last month actually, China's military sent a record number of warplanes into the air around Taiwan, while diplomats and state-run media warned of a possible invasion unless the island toes the CCP line. China warned that it would use nuclear weapons if any outside country involves itself in the conflict over Taiwan. Now, I said there are some US forces currently in Taiwan, and there's a defense arrangement between the US and Taiwan. Apart from the danger of war, if anything goes up there, you've got a huge number of supplies which come from both China and Taiwan into the rest of the world. They're now a key part of the whole economic structure of the world. Once the supply chain goes down, it's already going down in China anyway because of COVID, then you have a shortage of supplies right around the world. One of the things people may not know is that Taiwan produces 90% of the world's semiconductors, which are used in all high-tech goods. So these semiconductors are needed for mobile phones, for cars, for all kinds of high-tech stuff, computers, everything. If this goes down, then Taiwan doesn't produce them, and the whole system is going to be really shaken to the core by what takes place. Okay, one more situation, Israel and Iran. General Hussein Salami, chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, said that Iran's regime plans are clear. Our strategy is to erase Israel from the global political map. So, pretty clear what he's saying. US is trying to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. If it fails, which looks likely, nothing will stop Iran from continuing its process towards nuclear weapons. Israel reckons it's only months away. Israel fears that Iran is close to being able to produce a bomb, and it sees this as a threat to its existence. The Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, a man called Aviv Kochavi, revealed recently that Israel has operational plans for a strike on Iran's nuclear program, as well as its missile and rocket sites. This would be then an attack on mainland Iran coming from Israel. If that happens, then it would set off a wider conflict for sure. Russia's allied to Iran, Russia's in Syria. Iran has missiles all around Israel, including in Lebanon. And Russia, Iran, and Turkey are all involved in Syria at this present time. These three countries have met several times to increase cooperation among their nations. And a first strike attack against Iran from Israel would certainly lead to a military response from Iran. It could actually provide Russia, Turkey, and Iran with the excuse that they need to launch an invasion of Israel. Have you heard anything about that happening in the Bible? A few people nodding their heads. Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. The power comes down from the north, led by a great power to the uttermost north, with Persia as one of the countries, Iran, Togarmah, which is probably Turkey, and other countries in alliance coming against Israel in the last days. An invasion of Israel. Could that happen? Same time as this happening, there is a rather extraordinary peace proposal which has come from Saudi Arabia. Probably haven't heard this in the news, but I get news from behind the news. As you may know, Israel has already made an alliance with several moderate Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, countries on the Persian Gulf area, and Morocco and others have been drawn into it. So there's a kind of movement amongst moderate Arabs to make some kind of a deal with Israel. Saudi Arabia, some are on the still interested but not actually made the alliance. But the Saudi representative of the UN said that the entire Muslim world will recognize Israel if it withdraws to the Green Line. The entire Muslim world will recognize Israel. Now, Saudi Arabia has some clout in the Muslim world. Do they know what they're saying? What does it mean if Israel withdraws to the Green Line? It means if it withdraws from the territories in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem. So if Israel withdraws from those territories, Saudi is saying that the whole Muslim world is going to make peace with Israel, end of conflict, peace and safety. Now, the Israeli foreign minister, a man called Benny Gantz, is already talking to the Palestinian President Abbas about this. President Abbas has also contacted Putin in Russia, saying that he needs some help to get Israel out of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and to set up the Palestinian state and to make the peace program. Present Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who's quite a right-winger, said no way, especially no way that Jerusalem would ever be divided. In fact, the key thing for Israel is that Jerusalem remains the undivided capital of Israel, never to be divided. But Bennett's only going to be there for another year, in fact. And because of the strange coalition arrangement which Israel has, in 2023 he's going to be changed with a man called Yair Lapid, who will then become the Prime Minister of Israel. He's much more of a leftist and more open to the idea of peace. And it occurs to me that the possibility is that from that point onwards you could then see some movement in that direction. So, peace, war, which one's going to be? Actually, when you look in the Bible prophecies, you see that both are prophesied for the end of days regarding Israel. Ezekiel 38 and 39 speaks about a war coming down from the north. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 speaks about a covenant which is made for a 7-year period by the prince to come, who I think is the Antichrist. And there is some kind of a peace agreement, describe it in Daniel chapter 9. Jerusalem as a burdensome stone is one of the subjects of Zechariah chapter 12. So Jerusalem is going to be the center of world attention. All these things are coming together. Now, one of the puzzles of biblical prophecy is to work out the order in which they happen. And people have different ideas about it. I'm not going to give you an order right now, but all these things are kind of in the pipeline. The peace and the war, and the issue over Jerusalem, over the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, that is in the pipeline. And events are moving that way. So are we moving towards the end of days situation? I think we are, for sure.